a fatal shooting by an ICE agent in Minneapolis has just become an absolute flashpoint. It's ignited this fierce national debate with two sides that, honestly, couldn't be further apart. So let's dive into this and unpack what happened, and maybe more importantly, why the reaction has been so incredibly polarized. So at the heart of this whole thing, it really boils down to one huge question. Was this a law enforcement officer making a split-second, life-or-death decision to protect himself? Or was it, as critics started saying immediately, an act of murder by a federal agency that's totally unaccountable? These are the two frames we're going to explore. Okay, to understand one side of the story, our main source for this explainer is an interview with the former acting ICE director, Tom Homan. And this was recorded less than 24 hours after the incident. So his reaction was immediate, and it really set the tone for the entire defense of the agent's actions. You know, for Homan, this was tragically predictable. He didn't see it as just some isolated event. He saw it as the direct result of what he calls hateful rhetoric against ICE agents, calling them Nazis and the Gestapo. He argues that this kind of language empowers people to interfere with federal officers, to even attack them, and that it creates the exact conditions that led to this shooting. All right, let's break down Homan's argument for why he believes this was a justified act of self-defense. He's drawing on his 4 decades in law enforcement to build this case, piece by piece. The core of Homan's position is really this. The officer believed his life was in danger. And under law enforcement guidelines, that's what authorizes the use of lethal force. He really insists this wasn't some reckless choice, but a calculated, split-second decision based on the immediate threats he was facing, right there in that moment. So this is what Homan calls the totality of the circumstances. He argues you just can't look at a short video clip and get it. You have to consider everything. The agent was on foot, staring down a 3-ton vehicle with no clear way to get out of its path. This was all happening in what he calls an unfriendly environment, where local police don't help ICE. And, critically, Homan claims the woman in the vehicle had been actively getting in the way of their operations earlier that day. All of these things together, he says, added up to the officer's reasonable fear for his life. But wow, the backlash was immediate, and it was severe. Critics didn't see a difficult situation. They saw an abuse of power, and they wasted absolutely no time saying so. So you have groups like Amnesty International, and they immediately framed the shooting not as self-defense, but as a symptom of a much bigger problem. In their view, this was just the inevitable result of what they call a, quote, cruel anti-immigrant agenda. They're basically portraying the agent's action as totally unnecessary and politically motivated. And then the political condemnation got even sharper. Some House Democrats on the Homeland Security Committee used the term secret police. I mean, that's language that, as Homan points out, is meant to evoke images of Nazi Germany. This wasn't just criticism. It was an accusation that ICE is basically an illegitimate force that's operating outside the law. And here we see the most forceful condemnation, which came from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who actually represents the area where this all happened. She calls it state-sanctioned violence. And she argues the solution isn't just to abolish ICE, but to hold individual people accountable. For critics like her, the whole system is broken, and this tragedy is all the proof they need. So you gotta ask, right? How can two sides look at the exact same event and see things so differently? Well, it all comes down to a fundamental conflict over the context, the language used, and the very mission of ICE itself. I mean, this just lays the two narratives side by side, and the contrast is just stark. Where Homan sees a brave officer acting in self-defense in a heightened threat environment, critics see secret police using unnecessary lethal force as part of a cruel anti-immigrant agenda. They even go so far as to suggest the agents are untrained amateurs. There's simply no common ground in this language. None. Now, to back up his claim of a heightened threat, Homan repeatedly brings up this statistic. He says that attacks on ICE officers are up over 1,300%. For him, this isn't just some number. It's a critical piece of the agent's mindset. It proves they are operating under a constant threat of violence. Homan also places a lot of the blame on the policies of so-called sanctuary cities. So what does he mean by that? He defines them as places where local jails and police departments are basically forbidden from cooperating with federal immigration agents. From his perspective, this policy is the root cause of these dangerous street confrontations. So here's how Homan connects the dots. First, he says local jails refuse to transfer custody of people over to ICE. Second, those same people are released back onto the street. Well, that forces ICE agents to go find and arrest them in public, in totally unpredictable environments, instead of in the secure setting of a jail. The result, he concludes, is a dramatic increase in danger for literally everyone involved. Ultimately, what this whole incident really reveals is a divide that's so deep, there just seems to be no path toward a shared understanding of the facts. The two sides aren't just disagreeing, they're making completely opposite demands. And it all comes down to this. On one side, you have Tom Homan pleading with everyone to just tone down the rhetoric and let the FBI's investigation run its course before rushing to judgment. And on the other side, critics are demanding accountability right now and the dismantling of the entire agency because they argue the system is just too broken to be trusted. And amid this whole war of words, there are very real-world consequences. Homan confirms that the officer involved has been doxxed, his personal information was spread all over the internet, and that both he and his family are now getting death threats. He says the officer is not doing well, that he's terrified for his family's safety. Which leaves us with this final question. When an event is immediately filtered through two opposing political lenses, with two sets of language and two completely different versions of reality, how is a shared truth ever discovered? Is it even possible? That's something to think about.